Please join me in prayer. Gracious and loving God, help us this day to understand and celebrate your dream for the world, to be transformed in Jesus' love, and to use our gifts to make a difference for others. Amen. Today's story, this feeding of the 5,000 in Scripture, is a story about limits. A story about when people feel like they've hit their limit and they don't have quite what it takes to meet the challenges of the day. The story starts with Jesus being tired out from ministering to people all day and getting in a boat and going to a different place. And yet when he arrives, there are so many people there waiting for him, and out of his compassion, even though he's at his limit, he ministers to them and heals. It's the story of the limits when the disciples understand that it's getting late and people are going to need dinner, and all they have are 5 loaves and 2 fishes for all these thousands of people. They've hit their limit. Embedded in this story, though, is not just a story about limits, and not just a story about God's power, even though that's what the story is about. Embedded also are practices. Practices for us when we reach our limits, or when we don't think we have enough to do what needs to be done. Don Gregory Dix, a monk in the middle of the last century, noted that in the Eucharist and in this story as well, Jesus takes, blesses, breaks, and gives the bread. And we might just think this is a recounting of what Jesus did, but I think what it's about teaching a pattern of how do we take the gifts we've been given as we approach our limits, so that God's power can work in us. So let me just take a few minutes with you today to talk about that 4-fold practice of living at the limits. At the beginning of the story, the disciples come to Jesus and they say, we need to send these people away because we don't have enough. We just have these 5 loaves and 2 fishes. But Jesus says, don't worry, you can feed them. And he takes the bread. He takes that little meager supply that they have. He takes it as it is. And that's the first step of this practice. It's to take what we have, to embrace what we have. Not just the abundance, but the limits. Not just what we have a lot of, but what we feel we don't have enough of. In any circumstance in life, it's to start with where we are. David Daniels, a good friend of mine who's a therapist, and, as all therapists do, work with people to try to change their lives. He always said that, one of the first steps is just acceptance. It's accepting yourself. It's accepting the situation with all the limits and struggles and everything else. It's to take those to yourself and accept them. Accept what this day has to offer. Accept the gifts that you've been given. Quit judging yourself for all that. Just accept what you've been given. And the second movement of what Jesus does is like it. And that's to bless or to give thanks for what we've been given. Now, all of us have learned from early childhood that when we're faced with a difficult situation, not to look at the negative parts, but to count our blessings. But David Steindl-Ross, who is a monk who teaches a lot about gratitude, says that's not really the Christian vision of gratitude, to give thanks. What we're called to do is give thanks not just for the blessings, but give thanks for the challenges. When we take the situation we find ourselves in, it's to understand or to recognize that God is there to surprise us and to be present even in the things that aren't so good. For us, that might be the fact that our children can't go to school, and so now we have to stay home and teach them. Can we give thanks for the fact that even though we're at our limits, that God might be at work in that? For those people sitting at home, can't go out, can't get together with their friends, how do we give thanks that maybe God can work in that? How do we take and accept where we are and give thanks for all of it? And Jesus broke the bread. Now, for many centuries, people have reflected theologically about what this breaking means. It's the central moment when we celebrate communion each Sunday, when we break the bread. And it recalls to us that Jesus was broken for us. And the reason it's the central moment, the deep wisdom of this moment, is because in the brokenness, a new way of life is opened up. I was remembering the other day the story from C.S. Lewis's The Chronicles of Narnia. And in the Chronicles of Narnia, C.S. Lewis talks about the old magic, the old ways, the old patterns, the old forces that people feel like they're trapped in a more normal way. He might speak about people being in a rut, but a not life-giving rut. It's a rut that might even be destructive. And when the great Aslan, the lion who represents Christ, sacrifices himself, when he lays himself on the great altar in this book, the altar is broken. And the old magic is broken. You and I look at times when we're pushed to limits, and we recognize brokenness. We recognize that things are not as they should be. And in our own culture, we don't like broken things. We avoid brokenness at all costs. We want to hold it together, not have it break apart. And yet this breaking reminds us that it's precisely in the breaking that new possibilities and new life are possible. When things break, we have an opportunity for something new. We live in a time of brokenness. Everything seems to be broken. The pandemic has broken our normal way of doing things. But this may be a gift we need to be open to, the brokenness. The killing of George Floyd has risen up for us, has raised for us the brokenness of our ways of doing things as a country. And our brokenness inside as people who might not recognize the struggle and the pain and the woundedness of our Black brothers and sisters. We are broken. And yet that's God's way of opening us to new things. To accept where we are, to give thanks for the whole situation, to allow ourselves to be broken. And what do we do with all that? We give. We take the gifts that we find in that brokenness and we give. When I first arrived at St. Paul's, there was a family who was here at St. Paul's, and this family had 4 children. 2 of the children were developmentally disabled, and one of the children had an illness in her life that meant she would only live about 16 years or so, and sure enough, She died shortly after I arrived, and I remember sitting with her mother, and I was thinking, wow, how does a person like you, you're at your limit, and now this tragedy of this child who was born with this illness has died, and she was only 16. And she said, this is what I do. She says, it's been really hard. But I've been able to take that experience, and now I go out to other parents who are dealing with limitations and illnesses of children, and I understand what they've gone through, and I try to bring some comfort and just some companionship of walking along the way. This mother was a person who took the life that had been given to her with all of its limits, living on the edge, extended. And she gave thanks for each one of those children. She could see even, they weren't perfect children. They were children nonetheless who gave and received love, and they were a blessing in her life. And then in the brokenness, in the sorrow, the sadness, the struggle of losing that child, she found a new way to give. What would it be like for you and me in all these situations where we find ourselves, we're like we're at our limit to have this pattern of life? What would it be like for it just to be a practice? Either first thing in the morning or when you find yourself at the very edge and you think, I just can't do this, just send all this away. What would it be like to live with that practice of accepting where we are, all the good and all the difficult, giving thanks, allowing the brokenness to break us open so that we might find new ways of seeing things, new ways of acting, and then to ask the question and to take the action of giving. Not because we have enough or not because we have it all figured out, but because that is the practice. To give even when we're at our end, even when it feels like we don't have enough. Take, give thanks, break, and give. This is the gift God gives us, to be a people who live not limited by the scarcity we feel in our lives, but to bear God's abundance into this world.